Hello, everyone. So as AJ mentioned, my presentation is looking at gender-based violence and healthcare services access among women living with HIV with patients for equity-oriented care. So in addition to the earlier late acknowledgement, so much AJ, I just want to name that I work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And given today's presentation topic, I just want to specifically name the link between colonialism and colonial violence and gender-based violence, as well as the way that colonialism shapes the ways people can access care and the context of violence. And again, just given today's topic, I just wanted to provide some resources for folks, just in case people might be in need of support. Also, please feel free to step out at any time and then get yourself a drink, beverage, and then come back again if and when you feel ready. And here's just a brief outline of what I want to cover. So I'll give you a bit of information about who I am and why I do this research. I'll give you some background about the research project. I'll briefly kind of outline how today's presentation fits into my thesis more broadly. And then I'll share with you some results and finally some implications. So I started working within a sexual assault support center in about 2015 and have spent about 6 years working with anti-violence organizations, primarily in a support role. Part of the reason why I did that work is because my life has also been impacted by violence. And I think bringing both lived experience and frontline experience to this research really grounds it in a way that extends beyond traditional academia. And some background on today's topic. So as AJ mentioned, I work with the SHAWNA Project, which is the Sexual Health and HIV/AIDS Longitudinal Women's Needs Assessment Project. So it's a community-based research project based out of Vancouver with 370 women living with HIV. There's both a quantitative and a qualitative arm, and my research specifically focuses on the quantitative side. And throughout the presentation, I'll be using the term gender-based violence to refer to any physical or sexual violence from any perpetrator. And we know that worldwide, 1 in 3 women have experienced gender-based violence. And factors like food and housing insecurity, incarceration, and settler colonialism contribute and shape people's experiences of violence. Most of the women in SHAWNA have experienced violence at some point in their lifetime. And we know from other research that people who experience violence also report barriers to accessing primary care that are sometimes specific to their experiences of violence. So that could include things like disclosing an experience of violence to a healthcare provider and then having them respond inappropriately to that disclosure. There isn't a lot of research that looks specifically at gender-based violence and access to HIV care, and specifically during the pandemic, there's even less. So that's kind of what I'm going to be focusing on today. And then I'll just briefly outline kind of how this all fits into my thesis. So objective 1 is the one that I'm going to be focusing on today. So determining who we were more likely to see and who we were more likely to miss during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then understanding how violence impacted access to HIV care. The second objective that I plan to look at for my thesis focuses on the transition of HIV medication information onto PharmaNet. So this took place in May of 2020 with very little consultation with people in the community and community organizations. So I'm interested to understand how this may have impacted the ways that people engage with pharmacies. And then the third objective is to look at how trauma and violence informed approaches to HIV care can impact art use, so like HIV medication, and viral load among women that experience violence. And so kind of broadly tying them all together, I'm interested in understanding the different ways that violence impacts people's access to care, care outcomes, and understanding ways that providers, as well as policymakers and implementers, can more actively resist re-traumatizing people through the healthcare system and also be more responsive to people's experiences of violence. So coming back to that first objective, looking at SHAWNA follow-up and HIV care access during COVID, we know that health and social inequities were exacerbated during the pandemic, but we don't really understand what this looks like for women living with HIV or what this might have meant for their access to care. So this objective has 2 parts. The first being to identify who we were more likely to see and who we were more likely to miss during the pandemic. And we were interested in looking at this because certain groups of people may have been differentially impacted during the pandemic, and people who experience barriers to participating in SHAWNA were also probably experiencing barriers to things like health and HIV care. The second component of this objective was to look at how HIV care access was impacted by gender-based violence. And the overall kind of goal was to understand how, or I guess the importance of equity-oriented care in the context of the pandemic and HIV care. And so equity-oriented care refers to trauma-informed, culturally safe, contextually tailored, and harm reduction approaches. Okay, and briefly some results. So this study included 246 women living with HIV. About 60% of participants were Indigenous, 30% were white, about 5% were Black, and 4% were women of another racialized identity. Just under half, so about 45% of participants reported a sexuality that has been historically minoritized. So gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, queer, and then among Indigenous participants, two-spirit identities. About 10% of participants reported a trans identity and 3% reported non-binary gender. And among Indigenous participants, about 13% reported two-spirit identity. Okay, so this is the breakdown of results from the part one of the objective. So first we compared women that we saw within the first 18 months of COVID to women that we saw in the previous 18 months. And then we used March 15th as our cut point. So we were more likely to see women who were satisfied with their social support for taking art, were more likely to be on art, and were more likely to report regular art use. We were less likely to see women whose sexuality has been historically minoritized, women who were racialized, used injection or non-injection drugs, or had experienced violence. And then for part two, on the left-hand side, you can see the factors that were significantly associated with an increased likelihood of reporting or difficulty accessing HIV care. So you can see different components of like racism, structural determinants of food and housing security, and then classes of HIV stigma. And then in a multivariable adjusted model, we found that women who experienced gender-based violence in the pre-pandemic period were 3.7 times more likely to report difficulty accessing care in the pandemic. And then finally, some implications. So of course, we would like to call for the elimination of all violence and the systems that perpetuate violence, including systems that systemically disadvantage key groups of people and colonialism. But while violence still continues to exist, we want to provide evidence that supports providers and systems in being more responsive to the existence of violence. So in part one, we found that certain groups of people were in fact experiencing or differentially impacted during the pandemic. And we highlight the importance of physical spaces and in-person supports in terms of reaching these key groups of people. And then in part two, we found that access to HIV care was informed by a multitude of factors, some including structural determinants, again, factors of HIV stigma. And yeah, we want this evidence to be used to kind of highlight the importance of providers and systems being more responsive to intersecting experiences of violence, stigma and discrimination, as well as economic security, and then kind of identifying the importance or like the benefit of equity-oriented care, specifically trauma-informed care. Yeah, that's it. So I just want to say thank you to all of the SHAWNA folks and participants who make this research possible. And thank you so much for coming.